We're joined today by Chess Crosbie, a Canadian lawyer and spokesman for the National Citizens Inquiry. Good day, Mr. Crosbie.
Mr. Vaughan, good day to you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I've seen you appear on a number of videos expressing the final report from the National Citizens Inquiry, which went Canada-wide. 305 witnesses, 94 expert testimonies. I understand that 63 Canadian officials were invited to attend, but none deemed to grace you with their presence, which is something that we might talk about as our discussion goes forward. But I wonder, for those not familiar with the National Citizens Inquiry, if you could perhaps start off by explaining what it is and how it formed and why it formed, please.
Yeah, sure, Robert. One thing you could mention as well, not only did officials not deign to grace the citizens of Canada with their presence and explain their actions, which I guess suggests something about their level of confidence and their ability to do so. The mainstream media, the legacy media, which includes big tech probably these days, they saw fit to basically ignore the National Citizens Inquiry as well. So as you said, it was a group of citizens coming together and deciding that if we didn't do it, if citizens didn't do an inquiry into the governmental response to the COVID crisis, then it was most unlikely that any government would. In other words, it was we do it or no one was going to do it. That's how it looked then, going back a year and a half ago. And in fact, that's still the case with one kind of minor exception. That's in Alberta. It wasn't a public inquiry that was conducted there. It was a review into changing legislation without public hearings in such a way as to make sure that people's rights and freedoms are more respected should there be another similar, pandemic type event. So I think the original premise that we had, that if we didn't do an inquiry to learn lessons from what happened and document it for all time as a legacy for all Canadians, government wasn't going to do it. And in fact, here we are now in 2024, and there's no indication that any government wants to do it.
As a matter of fact, I think if our audience was to go onto the internet and search for National Citizens Inquiry under news, you would find, very few articles. I did it myself yesterday and found one actually from the CBC of a local hearing in, I believe it was Winnipeg or in Manitoba. But other than that, it was completely blacked out, ignored. And I think that's telling, because usually criminals, ne'er-do-wells, people who are culpable, hide from the light. And that, I think, is exactly why the National Citizens Inquiry was shunned by those in power. Do you concur?
Yeah, no, you put that well. That little story in Winnipeg did at least acknowledge we existed, but it didn't delve into the subject matter of what we were finding out or any of the evidence. And that was the only recognition from mainstream media that we ever got. There was coverage, as you mentioned, from alternative media like Epoch Times, possibly the Western Standard, possibly Rebel News, and you can go on a list of others. But that was it. Those media, which are influenced by the dominant narrative or have bought into the dominant narrative or have been bought out by the dominant narrative, such as the money that Trudeau is shoveling into mainstream media to buy their loyalty, they saw fit to ignore this historic event, the National Citizens Inquiry.
I noticed that with the shunning, there's also cancellation of a lot of people who were mentioning things that were brought up during the National Citizens Inquiry, including the National Citizens Inquiry itself on Twitter. And perhaps other platforms. I understand that you've had problems with getting your videos on YouTube
Yeah,
not
we
be
have.
touched.
That's right. Yeah. So we're basically on Rumble. We haven't been the only organization to be censored, basically, by the Google vast global empire, of which YouTube is one leg of it. Lots of others, including John Campbell, you mentioned as we were chatting before, who's got a lot of followers. He uses the YouTube platform. But he's been warned by them in the past, and he's had to step very carefully not to avoid roadside bombs that might get him deplatformed. And what is he? He's simply an honest broker of scientific information, and that's why people follow him.
Exactly. And that's why I will be publishing this on Rumble and BitChute and Odyssey. I have yet to determine, maybe based on our conversation, whether or not I'll try to put it on our YouTube channel, but we already have one warning against us, and I don't want to tempt fate. So we'll see how that goes. Let's get into some of the legal aspects of the findings of the National Citizens Inquiry. Your expertise, though you're not practicing now, was class action lawsuits. What do you think might be the outcome from the inquiry's report regarding perhaps as an impetus to start class action lawsuits against those who perpetrated the lockdowns against Canadian citizens?
Well, for those who, despite the best efforts of governments and mainstream media like the CBC in particular, who's supposed to be a public broadcaster, but is more accurately described as state-sponsored media. For those who know of our existence, there's a treasure trove of information there, many witnesses, including many eminent expert witnesses. And if anybody is interested in litigation, be it class actions or some other kind of litigation to recover money for damages, then it's a treasure chest to go to for inspiration, for witnesses, for fact-finding and recommendations. So I'd recommend it to, well, every citizen of Canada to have a look at that report. So it's a source of inspiration. The evidence in it, in my understanding of things anyway, from my life as a lawyer, you can't just give a judge a copy of the National Citizens Inquiry report and say, here's the evidence. You've got to line up your own evidence and prove your facts and prove the opinions of experts in a court proceeding, if it ever does come to that, because oftentimes things settle, of course. But it's a great starting point, and it's a great, awakening point. We're still in a period where, we're unwinding psychologically from the damage that was done, the hysteria, the mass formation effect, mass hysteria, whatever you want, there are a number of words and labels you could use to describe it. But most of us collectively left our senses during the real intense period of COVID in 2020, 2021, less so in 22. We're coming out of that now, and in many ways, it's only the judges are beginning to come out of it too. They're part of society, let's not forget. And so I think there's an ongoing loss of trust in the public as to what they're being told through the dominant narrative, I'll say, or the government-sponsored narrative, which is reflected in mainstream media. I think there was a poll recently in Canada that only about a third of people think that mainstream media is trustworthy. That's only about a third. So people are increasingly looking for other sources of reliable information. That's a phenomenon that's not going to stop. So that means that people are looking for sources of reliable information like your podcast.
I found it interesting the other day was the Super Bowl. And one of the headlines in the news the next day was it was the most watched television program in U.S. history with I think it was 123 million viewers. This is directly on the heels of Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin, which received 250 million views. So I think legacy media, the yellow press, as I'm inclined to call them, is basically on the outs. It is a dying industry, luckily. Well, yes and no, luckily. I would like to see it to be an honest medium. But you appeared recently with John Campbell, and I think it was last month. And I noticed that I think you had 250,000 views, something like that. It was huge, probably more than you would have gotten if you were on the CBC or CTV, don't you think?
Yeah, I think I paired with John twice. The first time had 400,000 plus views. That was about the interim report.
Yeah, he has over 3 million subscribers. So the legacy media, the mainstream media, as we might want to call them, or the yellow press, are certainly on the outs. And I hope that more people in Canada are going to be finding you on and the National Citizens Inquiry on the internet and alternate media.
I just want to mention, Robert, that's a very good comparison, actually, between the reach of the Super Bowl through CBS. I watched that myself, and the Carlson interview with the president of Russia, which I also watched. That's quite a contrast, and it does say something as well. Sorry, I had another point, but I lost track of it. But that was a good one, worth mentioning.
There's been a decision recently from the Federal Court of Canada regarding the constitutionality of the declaration of the Emergencies Act, previously called the War Measures Act, by the Trudeau Singh government to basically trample on the rights, quite literally, trample on the rights of the Freedom Convoy protesters in Ottawa. What is your take on that decision? I noticed that you had a discussion with Bruce Party, a law professor, on it, which was fascinating. People can go to your site, National Citizens Inquiry, and find that interview, I think. But what's your take on that as a lawyer, and where somebody can take that declaration that it was unconstitutional and perhaps proceed from there legally?
Yeah. So, in talking to Bruce, he made the point that while it's worth observing that the government, without hardly an hour's hesitation, through Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, announced that they were repealing. Well, that was a political decision because it's obvious they took no time to get legal advice about the merits of an appeal and whether it was legally meritorious. It was an entirely political decision made, shooting from the hip. And so one of the points that Bruce made is, in order for the government to succeed on the appeal, they have to win on basically 4 issues. And, you could use the analogy that you can't leap a chasm in 4 jumps. It's most unlikely to work. So the upfront part of the decision was that, as a factual matter, the circumstances that were put before the judge, the factual circumstances, did not meet the tests spelled out in the Emergencies Act. The 2 tests spelled out. There was no crisis of national security. There was, in fact, no public order emergency. That was a fact finding by the judge, and applying it and using the test, applying it. So courts of appeal are supposed to be, and usually are, very respectful of fact finding. So there's a high burden on the government to show the government that the judge below somehow got it wrong.
Yeah. Now, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, during the lockdowns and the convoy, Prime Minister or former Prime Minister of Newfoundland, Brian Peckford, was diligently out there in the weather explaining to people what the intent was, as he is the last living founder of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, what the intent was of the premiers at that time in drafting that document. And I interviewed Bruce Party about that later on, after he appeared and testified in front of the National Citizens Inquiry. Our conception of our rights and freedoms under the Charter is different from what it says under the Charter. The letter of the law is different from the understanding of the law. We may think we have these rights. It has been proven that we do not. What is your take on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and how the courts have decided against the people in favor of Parliament when it comes to our rights?
Well, I think Bruce's analysis is, actually fairly deep, and he goes into how the courts, and at the top of the whole pyramid is the Supreme Court of Canada, have gone down the road of recognizing positive rights, which the Americans would actually call entitlements to various government benefits, as opposed to negative rights, which is basically, the right to be left alone by government as long as you're not harming society or other people. And his sort of larger and more fundamental point is we've become a society in Canada, and certainly here in Newfoundland and Labrador, maybe more than the rest of Canada. You're a former resident, now living in New Brunswick, I think. We've become a culture which, when we have a social problem, we look to government to solve the problem. I've come to see that as a very dangerous attitude, because we're ceding authority over our lives by that kind of an attitude. There's a problem, government, you got to solve it. Oh, there's an issue, we may not be safe. There's a germ going around, government, you got to protect us and keep us safe. That's the road to more authoritarian government. And that's Bruce's larger point, which he also made in his testimony at the National Citizens Inquiry. Obviously, that's a deep political, cultural issue. And if we change and head in the other direction, that's going to take a long time.
I think that the cultural zeitgeist of Canada is one of Big Brother must provide. And as long as we have that attitude, we're not going to get out of this hole, and we're going to see more Emergency Act being invoked again.
Yeah, and so that's Bruce's larger point, is our expectation that government will solve our problems and keep us safe. And that informs the way the judges approach the interpretation of the Charter. I'm not sure the defect is in the Charter. If there's a defect, it's more in the way the judges have approached the Charter. And unfortunately, many of us would say that the COVID crisis, not one of our important institutions really stood up for people who valued freedom and defended our rights. There was a collapse in all the institutions, from, the mainstream media through the courts to the police. Every important institution, organized medicine has to be mentioned, that we might look to stand up for rights, failed to do so. And you can see that all the way through the report of the commissioners and all the way through the evidence of the National Citizens Inquiry. So we've got a lot of work to do collectively as a country.
Yes, Matthias Desmet wrote the book on mass formation. He didn't coin the term, but he made it popular. Mass formation, where everybody all of a sudden goes in one direction like a herd. And I don't think it was gone unnoticed that you're right. Everybody went in that direction, with the exception of maybe 5, 10, 15% of the population. Every single institution, every single political party, barring perhaps the People's Party of Canada, were lockstep in implementing all of the measures that the so-called experts above us dictate to us. What do you make of that? That all of the political parties, let's just start with them, the political parties, progressive, conservative in provincial parliaments, were perhaps some of the worst. Doug Ford, Blaine Higgs here in New Brunswick. Some of the worst measures were implemented by progressive conservatives. The Conservative Party of Canada went along with almost all of the measures. In fact, early on, the new leader of the Conservative Party, is it Aaron O'Toole? Yes. wanted to invoke the Emergencies Act right at the beginning in 2020. And that didn't happen, luckily. But NDP, Green, Liberal, PC, Conservative, all in lockstep. Can you explain that?
Yeah, but first of all, as a factual matter, Mr. O'Toole was removed by his own caucus around about the time of the Emergencies Act declaration and the Freedom Convoy presence in Ottawa. So you could conclude that the Conservative Party caucus and frankly the Conservative Party rejected that authoritarian approach from that particular leader. They since selected a different leader, and he's on the record as favoring medical freedom, no vaccine coercion. And so right now, the leadership and the party seems to have a very different approach. I was there at the convention in Quebec City that voted on those resolutions, and there's a 2/3, vote in favor of medical freedom and no coercion. No coercion. Just for the record. Now, your question was again?
What do you make of the fact that all of these political parties were in lockstep? All of the provinces, all of the territories, the federal government, Singh, at the time, the Conservative government, were all in lockstep regarding the measures that were being implemented to supposedly flatten the curve.
Yeah, you said like this stampede that people went through was not spontaneous. It was encouraged by officials and government leaders, and it was accomplished on the basis of the inculcation of fear in the population. It was, in fact, if you want to look at it this way, a rather sophisticated psychological operation, or psyops, delivered from above, from within governments, certainly from within the security state in the United States. The details of it are less clear here in Canada. We don't have as much evidence, but it was perpetrated by the state itself. How many people, officials and government leaders were, in on the plan, so to speak, is hard to say. How many just got drawn along in the general stampede is also hard to say. But without the inculcation of fear, and I can remember listening to, analysis from medical people that would have had you believe that we were all going to be dead in the streets with nobody left to pick up the bodies. Well, obviously, that was fear porn. So the government practiced fear porn to get people to do what they wanted. No country is great or preserves its greatness on the basis of fear. Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke to that when he became president in 1932 at the height of the Depression. He said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." The fact that our governments tried to make us fearful shows the depth of their betrayal.
So we were betrayed by all institutions, all politicians, and abetted by the press, which receives funding from the federal government. I don't know that there's any particular press out there that you can mention that does not receive handouts from the government. And of course, anybody who's been in politics long enough knows that he who pays the piper calls the tune when it comes to the press.
Well, the ones that don't parrot the government line, like Rebel News, they've been refused any of the subsidy money. So that subsidy money to the press, it's dressed up as, oh, they need to, adjust. The poor business models are not surviving very well on the internet and so on. It's actually to buy loyalty. And in fact, it is buying loyalty.
It is. I think that everybody remembers, for example, the Toronto Star front page. Now, Toronto Star was actually started way back as a mouthpiece for the Liberal Party of Canada. It still is, even though at one point in time it actually endorsed the NDP. But the front page was shocking. Now you know what I'm talking about. Do you want to describe it?
Yeah, I think you're able to put it up for the
Mhm.
people who are viewing to see what I'm talking about. This is actually a photographic copy of the Toronto Star front page, August 26, 2021. Some people may remember this. I was shocked to my bootstraps when I saw it because it's uh, uh, it's basically a hate screed. The opinion writer, this is on right up there in the front page. I'll read the whole headline in great big letters. If an unvaccinated person catches it from someone who is vaccinated, boo-hoo, too bad. I have no empathy left for the willfully unvaccinated. Let them die. I honestly don't care if they die from COVID, not even a little bit. Unvaccinated patients do not deserve ICU beds, and so on and so forth. If that isn't an example of hate speech that deserves to be prosecuted, then I don't know what is.
There's such a thing as balance in reporting, and as a matter of fact, there's a voluntary organization of newspaper owners and editors that make sure that they are abiding by journalistic standards of balanced reporting. If they have one opinion, they're supposed to get another opinion so that people can make up their own minds. This, in my estimation, was completely lacking when it came to the lockdowns and to the measures imposed by the state on the people of Canada. The news on television, radio, and in the press was all one-sided. There was no dissenting viewpoint. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And you're touching on one of the ways to recognize fake news. And one of the hallmarks of fake news and fake news stories is they only quote one side. CBC, to take them as an example, has pretty much abandoned the previous journalistic principle that you tell both sides of a story, the idea of balance. What you get from CBC and many other mainstream outlets is experts say, and then the preferred narrative from the experts, and you can always find an expert to say anything you want them to say, follows, but there's never any contrasting or opposing critical expert viewpoint quoted. In other words, it's designed to make it appear as if there's a consensus amongst experts and nobody else has a different view. That is a hallmark of fake news, and we were made the victims of fake news all the way through this, including by the CBC.
There's one aspect of the entire affair that struck me, and that is that for the first time we were witnessing premiers and the prime minister come out and showcase a medical officer of health who would express their viewpoint regarding the expert opinion and what people must do. And the premier or the prime minister would be sitting there nodding with their mask on, and after they've washed their hands in the holy water of alcohol and expressing their viewpoint. I found it an abrogation of responsibility and duty on the part of the politicians to put forward a civilian medical officer of health who, yes, has powers under law. Rather than do that, I mean, if I was premier, I would go in front of everybody because the buck stops here and say, I have had this advice from our medical officer of health, and this is what I'm doing in response. Instead of that, what did they do? They sat behind the medical officer of health. What's your opinion on that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The government leaders, by and large, abrogated their responsibility. Sir Winston Churchill, actually summed it up very nicely in very few words, as he often did. He said, experts on tap, not on top. And in other words, you need to have expertise and experts available to you if you're a leader of government, if you're a political leader. But ultimately, it's your decision to, what choices to make. And there were costs and benefits to every choice being made about the government response to COVID, but the people who are politically responsible for the costs and the benefits were not making these choices. It was delegated and ceded to a bunch of people with narrow training and a narrow focus who never asked the questions about what collateral damage to society their decisions about such things as lockdowns were going to cause. I mean, I think we expect our government leaders to be people who don't panic when they're faced with significant societal problems. They should keep their heads screwed on and, not run around panicking. But that's what they virtually all did. I'm not aware of any cost-benefit analysis, which is a standard tool of government to decide on policy choices, being done throughout this period or even since. Because most of the political leaders who were in place during the COVID crisis are still in place federally, provincially, and they have to know that they're not going to look good if a proper analysis was done of the costs and benefits of their choices during this period. Consequently, the public's being deprived of learning lessons about how well the COVID crisis was managed by government or how badly it was mismanaged. How do we dismantle this apparatus, this censorship industrial state, as to which, the professional regulators in many cases have become a part and parcel of? Civil actions are good stuff. They uncover facts, documents, and so forth that people otherwise would not be aware of. But criminal charges need to be proceeded with in many cases. How you do that, a bunch of people have been strategizing over, because myself, I think you probably need changes in governments before it becomes possible. Right now, the various police forces across Canada are not willing to touch any of this. So, but as time goes by and the social conditions change in various ways, and people start realizing the truth as expressed by organizations like the National Citizens Inquiry and the Commissioner's Report, that truth dam will start to crumble, and there will be a social willingness to accept criminal charges, because enough of society will perceive that they have been, that criminal offenses have occurred. How do you do that? Normally, you do it by focusing on the lower down people in the criminal network or the criminal conspiracy. And you get victories with the small fry and build up from there. Another way you could start is by not trying to lay informations against government officials, but rather picking on other egregious behavior. And that example from the Toronto Star, the headline, "I have no empathy left for the willfully unvaccinated, let them die." Maybe that's a good place to start with a prosecution.
Yes, yeah. This brings to my attention one of the, I think, the lasting and dramatic negative consequence of everything that has gone on, and that is the lack of trust that people now have, not only in government, which was always there to begin with, but now it's like magnified tenfold, but the lack of trust people now will show towards their physicians, towards the medical profession as a whole. How can you trust your doctor when we know now that they are simply obeying the dictates of a bureaucracy rather than their own best judgment as a physician?
Well, there's been a breach of trust now committed by so many of these institutions. That's why I mentioned the word reconciliation. Usually commissions of inquiry into widespread social damaging courses of practice, it could be residential schools, just to pick a Canadian example, are considered to be not just truth-finding exercises like the National Citizens Inquiry was. they're considered to be also exercises in achieving reconciliation and recognition of violations that occurred. That reconciliation and therefore the rebuilding of these institutions in such a way that people in society are satisfied they've been reconstructed and will resist better the mass formation influence or the mass hypnotism influence or the hysterical influences that we've seen in the last 4 years. That reconciliation and rebuilding of institutions is not in sight right now. It's going to require a transition from the people in government who are responsible for those excesses and the authoritarianism to move on, and new governments to be established, and pressure from people in society at large to get the reconciliation part of the peace done and achieved. That's a big task yet to be achieved by Canadian society.
It is almost insurmountable task. It is Herculean to try to suggest that it could be overcome, at least maybe in a generation. You and I grow up in Newfoundland. We're almost the same age. I think that if I mention this to you, you probably can recognize what I'm talking about, and that is that we look to the politicians. I went out to a Joey Smallwood rally once, as a young man, politically just.
It would have been a worthwhile experience, and I'm sure you remember it.
I do, yes. It was at Mary Queen of Peace Parish Hall there. But anyway, the thing is that at the time, in the 60s, 70s, 80s even, you look to your politicians as men of respect, men of style and grace, of honor and integrity, who just simply disagree on particulars regarding political philosophy or how to get things done for the betterment of society. So you can look at the leader of one party and the leader of another party, look at them debate, and understand at the end of the day when they shake their hands, maybe the better man win, that it was a sport and between men of integrity. Today, I don't see that at all. I see nothing but hatred and vitriol and men of no class. Rarely. I mean, there are people who do stand out as people with class. President Putin stands out as a man of class, if you ask me, compared to Vladimir Zelensky. But I digress. What is your impression over the years? Because you were the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Newfoundland. You were the leader of the official opposition at one point in time. So you must know of what I speak.
Sure. And my father was a politician back in from the late 60s through the 70s to 1993. He was a cabinet minister under Mr. Mulroney. And in those days, so for example, there was a famous incident in which Dad said something about Sheila Copps, which caused a great kerfuffle.
I know it.
And yeah. Anyway, that was theatrical. Back in those days, you could have a great kerfuffle, but everyone knew it was for the purposes of theater. It was for political purposes, but it was theatrical. It wasn't a blood sport.
Yes.
And so when Sheila Copps published her autobiography or published a book, she asked Dad to write the foreword, which he did. So, I mean, that to my mind just symbolizes the way relationships were in those days. Politics was hard fought and fought to win, but it wasn't fought to destroy the enemy utterly. Today, that seems to be the way it is, and it's fought with a lot of bitterness and enmity. I just came back from Ottawa, where I testified on Monday before the Natural Resources Committee of Parliament. And you could see that at work in the committee hearings. The genteelness and camaraderie that you might otherwise expect is utterly missing. And it's become a kind of street brawl. People in organizations and in society generally take their cues from the leadership. And if you look at the way Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister currently, has conducted himself in the last number of years, throughout the COVID crisis, certainly, and in the last election, he's attempted to divide people. people take their cues from the top. They're not getting good leadership about values from the Prime Minister.
Where does the National Citizens Inquiry go from here, Mr. Crosbie? And how can people find all of these testimonies and the final report?
If you go to nationalcitizensinquiry.ca, you'll find the testimonies there. They're all preserved. They're also typed up. The French translation is in the process of being posted. The report can be found there. One way to go about finding your way around inside it, because it is somewhat lengthy, is to go to some of the recommendations that catch your eye and then backtrack to why they make those recommendations. That's one technique. Then, by all means, call or make contact with your member of the legislature, provincial and federal, your MP, and go and see them about it. Express your concerns, make sure they read it too. I've done that myself with my member of parliament 2 weeks ago, and with my member of the local provincial legislature a couple of weeks before that. They were receptive. They said they'd read it. And this is how politicians get things brought to the top of their consciousness. It's when constituents let them know it's important. So yeah, it's there on the website. We have accomplished what many people thought could never be done, a totally citizen-financed, citizen-led inquiry, which documented a very difficult and even cruel period in Canadian history. We are going to preserve that as a legacy for Canada and Canadians for all time. For a period of time, we're going to do our best to promote the awareness of the report and the recommendations and further action on that by at the political level. And then after a period of a few years, maybe 3 years, we're going to basically bookend it and preserve it for all time. There are others who think it's a worthy project for Canada to proceed with other similar hearings on related topics. And we wish them Godspeed to do that.
That's something I wanted to suggest to you, if I may, and that is that the National Citizens Inquiry is unique and historic in that it is a gathering of citizens, professionals, to look at a very broad action of government. Would it be possible for the NCI, for the National Citizens Inquiry, to maintain itself so that if anything else comes up, and I'm sure it will, although perhaps not as broad as the response to COVID, that they can react to and investigate and get testimony that would not otherwise be heard by the mainstream media or the government?
Well, many people think that there's a role for that kind of a function, and some people want to embark on that. Others of us think that it's important to preserve the legacy of the hearings in 2023 and the reports that emerged out of that, and to be careful to preserve the separate identity of those hearings and those reports. Those who wish to undertake further hearings and possibly further reports, all power to them, but we just want to make sure that the legacy hearings from 2023 are preserved with a separate identity, and there's a clear line between that project, which is now largely achieved, and any other project that may involve hearings.
Is the report available? I know it's 3 volumes. Is it available in print format?
I'm told that the first volume may be available on Amazon now in print form. Otherwise, it's on the internet, and you'd have to select parts that are of particular interest if you want to print them. But they'll eventually, and soon, I think, it'll all be available on Amazon in bound form.
Excellent, excellent.
Oh,
and the videos
all that
themselves?
is there. We were talking earlier about, how the press has betrayed Canadians and the censorship industrial complex. Just to focus on CBC in particular, there's excellent testimony by Marian Klauak, who is a longtime accomplished reporter in Winnipeg, and by Rodney Palmer. And if anyone wants to know about how thoroughly the CBC has bought into and wants to enforce the dominant narrative, those testimonies are well worth looking at. They don't take a lot of time, but it shows you the depth, frankly, of corruption and betrayal at the CBC and the need for their total reform.
I started noticing that something very different was happening at the CBC.
Who were we to deliberately withhold information the public needed to know and had a right to know in order to make a decision based on informed consent about their health?
They took an exceptional moment to decide that they would not be journalists, that they would instead be public health messengers. And the result is that Canada's national broadcaster has morphed into a state broadcaster. It's promoting government policy without question, while censoring, belittling, and shaming learned Canadians who dare to object and attempt to inform us of the truth.
Just as an aside, a personal aside, people are calling for the defunding of the CBC when I would say that not only do you strike it from the record, you raise the building, you salt the earth upon which it stood, rather than simply defund it. That's my level of animosity I have towards that organization.
Well, when the government changes, as it looks like it will in Ottawa, you should put your name in for president and oversee that.
Yes. Well, my first act would be to destroy it. Mr. Crosbie, I really appreciate what you've done with the National Citizens Inquiry, you and your colleagues alike, in preserving these testimonies, in giving a true history of what has gone on here. And I'm sure it's just the tip of the iceberg. You may have interviewed over 300 people, but there are tens of thousands of stories out there that have gone unheard. But if this is any example as to the tyrannical imposition that our government and medical health professionals have imposed upon us, then it is truly a sad day in Canadian history. And I thank you very much for your involvement on that and for taking the time today to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you for the chance to speak about this, but I also want to thank all your viewers and frankly, all Canadians who supported the National Citizens Inquiry, because of course, without substantial support from the public, we couldn't have brought it off, but it is there now as a legacy for Canadians. And we just need to bring it to the awareness of our legislators and Canadians generally, that it exists there as a legacy for Canada. So thank you for doing your podcast bit to promote that.
Thank you again, sir. Take care.
Thank you.